Thanks everybody for tuning into the Vanguard podcast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Gavin.
And today we've just been joined by Hannah Appel of Debt Collective, co-author of Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. How's it going today, Hannah?
It's going great. Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to talk to you. So first things first, I guess, for people who aren't familiar, could you tell us a little bit about the Debt Collective, described as a union of debtors, how that came to be and what you guys are working towards?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the Debt Collective, we organize debtors unions. And the kind of short story of how it came to be is that many of us core organizers met during Occupy Wall Street, that we now have a bunch of other people who organize with us, but many of us who kind of are co-founders of it met during Occupy Wall Street, kind of increasingly aware of how under finance capitalism, so much of what unites us is our debts, right? Whether it's our debts to the criminal punishment system, whether it's our medical debts, whether it's our student debts, whether it's utility bills that we can't pay. So just like if we're united by a factory floor, we have power over our boss if we withhold our labor collectively. All of us were kind of inching our way toward, okay, if we share a creditor, which is to say, if we share people who lend us money, if all of us withhold our debt payments, we actually have power over that system. So that's kind of how it got started. We organized the first student debt strike in the country, which I'm happy to talk more about. And yeah, here we are, but we don't only organize around student debt, medical debt, housing debt, debt in the criminal punishment system.
Yeah, with that, like student debt, at least, is since Biden won the Democratic nomination and won the presidency, it would seem that the student debt crisis is one thing that's really, gone under the magnifying glass, and it's become a really renewed push from activists, something that could potentially actually happen under the Biden administration, despite it being a little bit more of a neoliberal type, strain of the Democratic Party. What's your thoughts on that? And is this something that you're hoping to see accomplished, pretty immediately as soon as he is inaugurated?
I'm so happy you asked that question. I'm gonna start my answer to that question in a weird way in the year 2011. Okay, in the year 2011, a bunch of us organized something called 1T Day, which was the day that student debt hit $1 trillion. It now stands at $1.7 trillion. So we've nearly managed to double it in less than a decade. On 1T Day, the media covered 1T Day. It was pretty successful action, and they derided us. They laughed at us, right? And this is even like kind of centrist liberal media. They're like, oh, these people want their debt discharged and they think college should be free. Never mind that it's their historical amnesia that they don't actually remember public college meant free college. But I start in 2011 to answer a question about Biden for the following reason. So the Debt Collective gets organized in 2014. We organize the nation's first student debtors union. It's a group of folks who have debts from for-profit colleges. They go public, refusing to pay their student loans. We kind of pioneer something called defense to repayment, which is like a legal mechanism through which you can claim that your school defrauded you and therefore have a legal defense to repayment. 90,000 people fill this out. The Debt Collective strikers are called to the Department of Education under the twilight of the Obama regime to help at something called a negotiated rulemaking. In other words, right, the power of unionism wins. We're called to the table to negotiate with those in power. And now, as you rightly point out, we've just been through a presidential cycle. Oh, I should say also in there, Ilhan Omar, Pramila Jayapal draft legislation called College for All, which would discharge all 1.7 trillion, make public college free again on the back end. They invite the Debt Collective to DC to announce that legislation. And so here we are now in 2020, having just been through eventful presidential season, right? Where, Gavin, exactly as you say, every single candidate across the spectrum, from the farthest right to the farthest left, had to have a position on student debt. 9 years ago, they laughed at us, right? And now, here they are, even the fucking Republicans, excuse my language, I don't know if I'm allowed to
say whatever the fuck you want on this show. Okay. Yeah, no, say, yeah.
Even the Republicans have to have a plan. And Gavin, as you say, Biden has a plan. We've had some meetings with the Biden team. It's not a great plan, but it is a great opportunity for activists. We are so close to a win. So the Debt Collective will be launching pretty soon the Biden 100. I'm happy to talk more about that. But yeah, we're close to a win for sure.
Yeah, I want to talk about the student loans a little bit more, but I feel like one of the things that we should really kind of address that you mentioned in the beginning, this isn't just a student debt movement. I think that a lot of times what gets lost in leftist circles, when, especially when you're dealing with a lot of people who have, graduated from elite institutions, the conversation towards student loans is pretty narrow because that's something that everybody's dealing with. However, typically a lot of working class individuals who may be really struggling with, payday loan debt, credit card debt, probation debt, things like that, that are just as debilitating, just as crippling, if not more so. And they feel like they're, when we make demands for, the abolition of student debt, that what we're going to do is just further perpetuate this like PMC hierarchy, this caste system where the haves and the have-nots. I'm wondering how you respond to that when you see somebody that, kind of brings that forward in good nature as a working class individual, and how you might dissuade some of their fears that they're going to be left behind in all this.
Absolutely. I think that's a really fantastic point and a really important question. One of the things that I would say is that if you actually look at the demographics of folks who hold student debt, it is no longer the case that people who have debts from college, debts from a master's program, even debts from a PhD program, come from the bourgeoisie, come from the capitalist class, it certainly was the case historically. But ever since you can barely get a job at Starbucks with only a high school degree, let alone a college degree alone might get you a job at Starbucks, right? Which is to say that if you actually look at the class demographics, the race demographics, the gender demographics, but class demographics is how your question was phrased to me. The class demographics of folks who hold student debt, it is disproportionately people who come from working class backgrounds. Part of that is because of the incredibly aggressive, what is this called when you marketing strategy of for-profit colleges, right? So for-profit colleges for decades after they were deregulated very intentionally went after single mothers. They very intentionally went after veterans and their GI benefits. We know that veterans disproportionately come from poorer families, right? Because it's looked at as a way to kind of climb the social ladder, among other reasons.
Well, it's one of the primary reasons that we got rid of public tuition to begin with, right? We had to get rid of the draft because of Vietnam and all these student protests. How do you make sure that there aren't student protests? You get rid of fucking kids off campus. So,
yeah, literally. Reagan said it. It was when Ronald Reagan became the governor of California, right? And that it was 66 and he had watched all those protests unfold. There's some great quote. Let me see if I can try to pull it from my brain. It's something, this is like verbatim Reagan. He was like, people are going to think twice, meaning if we charge tuition, people are going to think twice before going to college to carry a picket sign. I mean, quite literally, as you say. So I guess my first response would be, it is true historically that wealthier people, right? Folks from the middle class, folks from the bourgeoisie, folks from the capitalist class were the people who were going to get college educations, let alone master's and PhD degrees. That is no longer the case. But more broadly speaking, you're exactly right that the debt collective and the idea of debtors unions expands far beyond student debt to medical debt, to debt from the criminal punishment system. Folks who have been incarcerated leave with about $16,000 in debt. Disproportionately men, right? Black and Latinx men who are incarcerated.
Like in the box that says they're a felon for the rest of their life, which means that they're not going to be able to get a job to pay off any of that anyway, and they're going to be the recidivism rate. Totally.
So all of those debts that you point out, whether it's credit card debts, whether it's payday loan debts, right? All of those debts we understand as within the kind of tactical and strategic possibility of debtors unions, which is to say building power over the systems that oppress us, right?
Yeah. And to pivot back a little bit more towards, student loans, but this of course applies to all kinds of loans under the, massive predatory capitalist system that we have. Matt Taibbi just did reporting the other day talking about a 59-year-old man, who borrowed $79,000 to go to college. He's paid back $190,000 and he owes $236,000 on his loan. So could you just talk about the miracle of compounding interest and how it works great for the working class?
That's so funny. I was about to use the phrase. I was like, I would love to talk about the miracle of compounding interest. Yeah. We are very familiar with the miracle of compounding interest on student loans in our family. We also have been paying $500 a month for I don't know how many years, and our loans amounts just go up and up. So, the sort of basic description of compounding interest is as follows. So like in their fancy jargon, the initial amount that you borrow is called the principal, right? So if the principal of your loan is $10,000, interest rates on student loans are astronomical, especially compared to interest rates right now. So we consolidated all of our loans and they're at about 7%. Right now you can get them slightly lower, but they're generally hover at around 7%, right? So you have to pay, in addition to whatever you owe monthly, you have to pay that 7% interest. And if you can't make a monthly payment plus interest, whatever it is that you cannot pay gets added back to the principal. So then when that 7% is calculated the next month, it's 7% of a larger number. And so the story that you tell, that Matt Taibbi reports on, that's true of my family too, is true of so many people. We try to do the right thing, right? We try to pay more money than we can afford every month. And yet we've paid for our education so many times over. So yes, the miracle of concept, and this actually gets me back to one more Biden detail, which I'd like to share.
Of course.
Student debt has a couple things. All different debts are household debts are each specific in their own ways. And one of the things that's specific about student debt is it doesn't come with a lot of the so-called protections that a lot of other consumer debts
Can't go bankrupt. Thanks, right? Joe Biden.
Thank you. Exactly. It is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. And that is all thanks to Joe Biden. So there would be a particular, what's this word, like beauty, if Joe Biden were to be the one to cancel student debt, because he's done a tremendous amount to make it kind of stick with everybody as they struggle financially and otherwise.
Yeah, you kind of touched on an interesting point, which I think is incredibly important. And it's one that was something that really, what first got me thinking about debt in a big way was when I just sort of randomly came across David Graeber's work and his mammoth on, the first 5,000 years of debt. Rest in peace, David Graeber, but we talk about him on the show a lot. He really influenced my thinking. And one of the things that he does is from right off of the bat in this book is he kind of he goes back to like, what do we fundamentally understand to be just, right? People consider paying your debts to be a moral necessity, right? He goes back to like Plato's Republic when he asks, what is justice, right? You have to pay your debts, you have to not tell lies, right? And yet he kind of foils his whole idea to talk about how one lesson that humanity learned, and if you look at, religious texts, whether that's Hinduism, the cosmic debt, or, he actually provides a translation of the Lord's Prayer, which is instead of forgive us of our trespasses, it's forgive us of our debts, a different translation, right? I want you to talk about how our society has really, manipulated this idea that it's an ethical or moral shortcoming, a personal failure for individuals who cannot pay their debts, and how that's used to the benefit of the, the financial class, the bourgeoisie, right? One of the things that, we often joke about on the show is all the things that it's like okay to do if you're rich, but low class to do if you're poor. And one of them happens to be defaulting on debt. Just look at the career trajectory of Donald Trump or anyone else in high finance after 2008, right? So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just start by saying, so in my day job, I'm also an anthropology professor, which is the job that David had. And David is a friend and was a friend. And so I'm always happy to hear his name brought up in these contexts.
Hugely inspirational to me just as a thinker. So yeah, if you knew him at all, like what a treasure that must have been.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to say that and acknowledge you, David. But yeah, so this question around the morality of debts, right? This is something that as organizers at the Debt Collective, this is the first significant hurdle to organizing that we face, right? Because there is so much morality around debt and the kind of the imaginary of this morality, or which is to say how people picture it is like, the nice banker out there lent me money and that generous banker was so nice to me. And therefore I, the kind of unworthy debtor, am obligated to pay that banker back. So what we're imagining there is like a dyadic relationship, a relationship between two people where I, as an individual, the debtor, have a relationship to somebody who is morally superior to me because they have been generous in the first instance, right? And so I owe them. This is not how debt works. This is not even close to how any of the debts we're talking about work. So one of the first projects that a group that preceded the Debt Collective, Strike Debt, did that got a lot of play was this project called the Rolling Jubilee, right? Where we wanted to show kind of a hack of debt infrastructures. We wanted to show that debt isn't this moral relationship between lender and borrower, right? So the Strike Debt got licensed, or the Rolling Jubilee project got licensed as a debt collector, and we bought defaulted debts on secondary markets. Huh? What does that mean? Secondary markets. There is no lender and creditor, and this poor lender, if you don't pay back, they're not going to make any money. No, they sell those debt obligations to debt collectors for pennies on the dollar. They get a tax write-off from the federal government if they're a hospital, and then the debt collector gets to come after the debtor for like not only the entire amount of the debt, but then all of the late fees, all of the interest, right? Which is to say, the morality isn't between a benevolent creditor and an unworthy debtor, right? These are expansive financial relationships that creditors know how to use for profit. And of course, they have entire lobbying arms. We might even say they have unions behind them. And when they can't pay their debts, they get bailed out, right? That was the whole lesson of 2008. And that is, we are again seeing the lesson of the coronavirus, right? Whereas who still experiences the morality? Just the little debtors, right? Like, oh no, I can't pay my debts. They don't pay their debts either. So the question that we always ask to kind of turn around the morality is, who owes what to whom? Who is actually owed in this situation? Working class people are owed medical care. They are owed education. They are owed housing, right? Those things should not be capitalist commodities that folks at the top are able to buy and trade as speculative assets. People are owed that as public goods. So trying to change the kind of conversation around morality with that question of really who owes what to whom.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and something that a lot of people, I just don't really think they understand or realize when it comes to debt is, as you mentioned, so many of the biggest and most successful corporations out there are themselves in debt. Like, I remember reading an article about how Netflix, which is, one of the biggest, most popular, if not the most, streaming service out there, has been for a while now. It's, consistently always in massive amounts of debt. It's basically just operating from this position of constant debt. Well, meanwhile, you mentioned, the little guys out there get completely screwed over when they fall into, debt. So can you just speak a little bit about how, we have this, completely backwards model of success versus failure, and how some of the most quote unquote successful companies and corporations and all of that are, completely saddled with this debt too. They just get away with it and profit.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really radical double standard, right? But part of the reason that it's a double standard, exactly as you say, is that corporations understand that debt is an instrument of power, right? So you can go into debt in order to get something done in the near term and hope to be what? Bailed out, paid back, right? But you understand it as a way that you can kind of manipulate time. And in corporations, amongst very wealthy individuals, right? We already heard about Donald Trump, whether it's dealing with bankruptcy, whether it's leveraged buyouts, whether it's bond trading, right? Our entire sort of capitalist financial economy revolves around understanding debt as a form of power, as a form of leverage. But it doesn't do that for us at the bottom. And that's the wager of the Debt Collective, is that it can do it for us at the bottom too. Now that we are all so deeply indebted, right? Like I named the statistic earlier. If we just think about student debt alone, it's $1.7 trillion. That is a tremendous amount of leverage over a system that we think should work differently. And if we can unionize that, right, which is to say, if we can collectivize that, then we actually do have some leverage over the system. And in that particular case, we're close to a win, because I feel like we have found leverage over that system. Now it's just to get to housing, it's to get to medical care, it's to get to the criminal punishment system in terms of getting rid of incarceration altogether, right?
Yes.
That's not the problem. But.
No arguments there. To stick on the topic of housing for a moment, right? There was a statistic, or I guess it's not a statistic, it's just a fact that came out, right? 9 million renters or mortgage backers, I think on average $5,400 behind. This is the kind of, consumer debt, right? For a working family, a working individual in the United States, right? That's the kind of thing that they're just never going to be able to overcome. So if we do not introduce this conversation of at least a limited jubilee, right? At least a limited debt cancellation as it comes to back owed payments on rent, on, federally backed mortgages, all those kinds of things, we're literally going to propel the entire society into a sort of chaos, right? Which I think is interesting if you look at the history of the United States, which has specifically used housing and mortgages as a way of, utilizing the power of debt, like you mentioned, against and wielding it against the working class. And actually, I'm not sure if you were involved in the writing of this piece, but there was an excellent piece in Jacobin by Debt Collective where you guys, somebody from the collective wrote about Henry Ford and how Ford Motors, they wanted everybody to have mortgages as a way of, creating a docile, malleable workforce, a workforce that was not willing to jeopardize their position of, lower middle class in an effort to become a more comfortable middle class, right? They were given, something at a low bar, and then they had to cling to it and fight for it. And that's kind of been American history. So I'm just wondering where you think about all of that and at what point the rubber needs to hit the road for specifically debts owed on rent.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we are in a watershed moment in terms of not only awareness of how deeply debt structures unevenly all of our lives, but also what could be done about it, right? Because before the coronavirus, housing was already a fucking catastrophe, whether you were talking about rent prices, whether you were talking about trying to buy a home, right? It's not like this is a new problem, but what the coronavirus has done is just kind of revealed the depth of the problem. And what else it's done is introduce to the general public the word moratorium, right? So it's not only student debt payments that were randomly put on hold. Oh, surprise, moratorium. It's also rent payments that were put on hold. For some people, it's mortgage payments that were put on hold. So first of all, it's a precedent, right? It's like, oh, wait a minute. They can just stop those payments if they want to. Why, yes, they can. But as you say, if you just simply stop payments and you stop currency from circulating altogether, we will come into like even a deeper crisis than we're in right now. So what we do need is zero evictions and cancel rent, which is to say, in my opinion, it should be a federal government infusion of cash to cancel all those back rents. But we need people power to be able to make those demands, to be able to shape those demands. So it's something, the last statistic I saw, and this may be wrong because you're giving a 9 million one, which might be slightly different, but it's 30 million people across the country who have either paid none or a smaller fraction of their rent since last March. 30 million people. Can you imagine, these are tenants now, this is not talking about homeownership or the attempt at homeownership through mortgage debt. Can you imagine a tenants union 30 million strong, right? We have a super strong tenants union in LA, the LA Tenants Union.
Same with Kansas City, Casey Tenants.
Yeah,
Shout out to Casey Tenants, yeah.
So the Debt Collective and tenants unions are already a precedent for debtors unions, right? The reason that tenants union have power is because they have a shared relationship to a creditor who is their landlord. And if they withhold rent together, they can make more effective demands of that landlord than they could as an individual debtor, right? It is already a debtors union. So the Debt Collective, we've been having all these really interesting organizing conversations. We're collaborating with the LA Tenants Union here. There's ATUN, which is like the Autonomous Tenants Union network, I think, that we've been doing a bunch of stuff on because people are just sort of waking up to these relationships between tenants unions and debtors unions. So at the Debt Collective, well, okay, I'll get to that in a minute because we have a project around it. But one thing that I will say, in California and in New York, at the state level, both of these states, part of their COVID renter protections, quote unquote, is to convert rent debt into consumer debt. So what's the difference? Well, rent debt, if you owe it, the kind of collateral on it or what can be taken away from you is your home, right? You're going to be evicted.
Right.
Whereas if it's
consumer debt follows you forever.
Yeah, then it just follows you
Put
forever.
it on your credit
home
card.
Can't be taken away. So that this is nominally what they're saying is doing you a favor because you get to stay in your home, but then it converts into household debt. So now even more directly, we can see what will happen to tenants, certainly in California and New York, but these are often bellwethers for the kinds of legislative maneuvers that are going to happen elsewhere in the country, that it's going to be turned into consumer debt. So the Debt Collective in California right now is collaborating with the LA Tenants Union and other tenants unions. We're making a tool. This is kind of a longer story. You can tell me if you're interested in it. But that what we often make these pieces of legal mutual aid that then actually help people, in this case, stay in their home because it will allow them to file the legal papers that respond to the immediate eviction, and use that legal tool, which people badly need, to onboard them into collective organizing so that we can start to push back together, especially because increasingly we're seeing, especially after 2008, a concentration of landlords, right? So single family homes or landlords that went, or homeowners that went belly up under 2008, all of those properties are bought up by private equity or other kind of large corporate conglomerates, which actually means, even though it is awful in practice, that now as organizers, we have much more concentrated targets, right? So if we get a whole bunch of people, we can target the Blackwaters, we can the BlackRocks, we can target
verbal
the
slip, I understand.
Like fantasies of tenant organizing and debtor organizing, but that's a project that we're working on right now in California, but eager to bring elsewhere once we kind of see proof of concept and make sure that it's working as we want it to.
Yeah, I think that, what's really, I guess, exciting and unique about Debt Collective as opposed to a lot of other leftist organizing is that it seems like there's a lot of organizing around, tactics, right? And I don't mean that as a way of digging into other lefties, right? Everybody is, doing this with a really clear intention. But what I think really distinguishes, and what you guys have evidenced it by the $1.8 billion in abolished debt. That's real numbers. That's real impact on people's lives. Just one last question that I had for you today was, for people on the outside, right? So for anybody who's listening to this show, maybe they're not themselves struggling with this crippling debt, what can they do to get involved, right? A lot of times, we want to see, obviously they're, and maybe are struggling with like a minimal amount of debt. You look at these astronomical numbers and it's like, your $200 payment to your fucking student loan provider doesn't seem so bad, right? So I'm just wondering what kind of effective, organizing can people do when they're not they themselves necessarily dramatically impacted by this in the horrifying ways that so many of our, working class comrades have been, but they're, desperate to kind of help in any way that they can. What kind of organizing have you been most effective? What kind of disputes have you raised that have been effective?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say to those people is, visit us at debtcollective.org. And I saw that somebody kind of had it up, screen sharing, like browsing around the website, I think is helpful to get a sense of what we do, to get a sense of the debt dispute tools that we do have available. So if you go to the tools section of our website, those are free debt dispute tools. So anybody who's working with like local grassroots community orgs or knows people who are affected in ways that they aren't, those tools are free to use for everyone. We run tool clinics. DSA has used them all over the country. I mean, they are free to use, and we do lots of train the trainer, but they're easy to use. They're self-explanatory. So there are a bunch of debt dispute. There they are. Together, we own the bank. Dispute your debts and collections, dispute errors in your credit report, dispute wages being taken, etc. So all of these are free for everybody to use. I would also recommend, I think the reason that the timing of this show is because we do have this new book out.
Yes.
They Won't Pay. So I would really recommend that people pick it up and read it just to get a sense of the gravity of the situation that we're talking about. Because we're not just talking about individual debts or household debts, right? Which some people may or may not have. We're also talking about municipal debt, right? So when we think about disproportionate state violence, right? Cop violence against Black communities, for example, we cannot think of that separate from the municipal debt situation in Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed, right? We cannot think of what's going on in Puerto Rico and sort of the US imperial, what's going on in US empire without also thinking about debt, right? So I think that there are all kinds of ways that even for folks it doesn't touch their individual household's life, that you see it touches the life of your city. If you have children or are a child or are thinking of having children and you want them to go to a public school, right? I mean, this is like really the fabric of our society and what we can count on as public goods, and demanding public goods like education, like healthcare, like housing, like a thriving environment for everyone. So yeah, I'd recommend picking up the book, checking out the website. You can
find a link in Haymarket books in our description below. I believe it's actually on sale right now on Haymarket, so everybody be sure to check it out. If you grab the digital version, it's like $6. That's what I did. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Hannah. We really appreciate it, and we'd love to talk to you in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.